You're sitting on the edge of your bed. You've been about to get up for about 45 minutes. Your brain isn't blank, it's loud. It knows exactly what needs to happen. Reply to that text. Open the laptop. Start the thing. The instructions are clear, and your body still won't move. Not tired, not distracted, just frozen. Like the signal between your brain and your limbs is stuck on a spinning wheel. That feeling has a name. It's commonly called task paralysis, but I'm going to call it activation failure. And it's not about effort or discipline or caring enough. It's about what happens inside an ADHD brain when it tries to turn intention into movement and the signal just doesn't fire. And who am I to rename that invisible wall between knowing and doing? My name is Dr. Sulman Aziz Mirza, triple board certified in adult psychiatry, child and adolescent psychiatry, and addiction medicine. And if you've ever stared at a simple task like it was a brick wall, well, that's me every day, and this is how I learned to Kool-Aid Man it. So let's talk about what's actually happening under the hood, because most people have the wrong model entirely. When people think about ADHD, they think about attention. Can't focus, they get distracted, bounces between tasks. And yeah, that's part of it. But for a lot of people with ADHD, the deeper problem isn't attention, it's activation. The brain knows exactly what it needs to do. It understands the task. It might even want to do the task, but it can't push the start button. Think about when your YouTube video freezes. You've got fast internet, brand new laptop, the video is fully loaded, but you hit play and nothing happens, just the spinning wheel. You tap the screen again, still nothing. The data exists, the hardware works, your intention is completely clear, but the signal between press play and video start just doesn't fire. That's activation failure. Intention at 100%, movement at 0. And here's the part that changes everything. Most people think that motivation comes first and action follows. You feel ready, then you start. But for ADHD brains, that sequence is actually backwards. Movement comes first. Motivation shows up after. Which means waiting to feel ready is a trap because readiness is often the byproduct of starting, not the prerequisite for it. And that one shift alone can completely change how you approach every task you've been waiting to feel motivated enough to begin. But the brain doesn't stay neutral while you wait. It looks for another way to activate. When the normal dopamine pathway, that quiet internal signal that says this matters, let's go, isn't strong enough to get things moving, the brain starts looking for a louder signal. Panic, adrenaline, the cortisol spike that hits when the deadline stops feeling distant and suddenly becomes real. That signal is loud enough to cut through. So the brain learns to wait for it. And this is where the cycle starts. You avoid the task because starting feels impossible. Avoidance creates guilt. Guilt turns into dread. Dread makes the task feel even bigger, which makes starting feel even harder. So you avoid it even more. And then the crisis hits. The deadline is tomorrow. The consequences are suddenly real. And out of nowhere, something switches on. Hyperfocus locks in. You tear through 6 hours of work in one sitting. And afterward, there's this massive wave of relief. Until it happens again next week. This is the line I really want you to hold on to. A lot of people with ADHD don't develop consistent activation. They develop emergency activation. Over time, the brain gets conditioned to treat stress like an ignition switch. Panic becomes the thing that finally creates enough neurological signal to move. And the dangerous part is, it works. Not every time, but often enough that the pattern gets reinforced. The brain learns waiting until the last second is how to get shit done. So it keeps doing it. And eventually people start believing they can only function under pressure, that they need the deadline, that they somehow work better stressed. Some people will even create artificial emergencies just to feel capable. But that's not a personality trait. That's a conditioned response to a broken activation system. And one quick thing worth mentioning here. When stimulant medications help, this is partly why. They don't inject motivation into somebody who, quote, doesn't care. They reduce the friction between intention and movement. They lower the activation threshold. That gap between I need to start and I'm starting, that's what gets smaller. That's not a moral failing being fixed. That's a neurological gap being bridged. And that difference matters. Because if you've spent years believing that you're weak or lazy or irresponsible or secretly incapable, understanding this mechanism changes the entire story. So now you've got a brain that struggles to self-generate activation, waits for emergencies to substitute for it, and slowly gets conditioned to depend on stress as its operating system. That's the mechanism. That's what's been happening in the background every time you've wondered, why can't I just start? Before I give you anything practical, I want you to reframe what practical actually means here. Because if you walk away thinking that these are productivity hacks, they probably won't stick. These aren't hacks. They're friction reducers. The goal is not to force yourself into having more willpower. The goal is to lower the activation cost enough for your brain to cross the starting line. That sounds like a small distinction, but it's not. It changes how you approach everything. Because most people with ADHD already know what they should do. The problem is the gap between knowing and moving. So let's start there. The first thing to understand is this. The task you're avoiding is probably too big as your brain currently understands it. Not because you're incapable of doing it, but because your brain can't grab onto clean my apartment. That's not a task, that's an entire category. Same thing with write the paper, fix my finances, answer my emails. Those aren't starting points. They're giant undefined blobs with no clear entry point. So, shrink the task until the activation cost becomes almost microscopic. The task is not write the report. The task is open the document. That's it. Not because opening the document magically solves a problem, because momentum has a chance to exist after movement starts. You're not tricking yourself. You're removing the part that was neurologically too heavy to lift all at once. And this is where a lot of ADHD advice goes wrong. People will say things like, just break it into smaller steps. But even smaller steps are often still too big. The real question is, what's the smallest possible action that creates motion? Not progress, but motion. Because motion changes brain state. And once movement starts, the activation threshold usually drops. The second thing that helps is reducing environmental friction before the moment you need to start. Because friction lives in the space between I should begin and I'm beginning. Every tiny obstacle matters more than people realize. So what does this actually look like in real life? If I plan on exercising after coming home from work, I'd have my pre-workout drink on the drive home. Gym clothes already out in the bathroom for changing. And water bottles ready to grab. If I'm preparing a presentation or a project, that means my laptop is already open. The tab I need already pulled up. And a cup of coffee ready to go as well. Every obstacle you remove ahead of time is activation energy you don't have to spend later. The path should already be cleared before your brain arrives at the starting line. And third, body doubling. This one sounds weird until you experience it. Working near another person, even silently, often lowers the activation threshold dramatically for ADHD brains. No conversation required. No collaboration required. Sometimes, just having another human present in the room is enough. A friend studying nearby. A coworker on Zoom. A study with me video playing in the background. Something about shared presence helps the brain stay anchored long enough to begin. It's truly one of the most effective, low-effort tools available to you. Now here's the last piece, and honestly it might be the hardest one emotionally. Stop waiting to feel ready. That feeling is not arriving first. For a lot of ADHD brains, readiness is the reward after starting, not the condition required before it. And this is where people lose hours and sometimes years, because they keep waiting for a mental state that only appears after movement begins. So, give yourself permission to start badly. A terrible first sentence, a messy outline, one email draft that sounds awkward, 5 minutes at the gym instead of a perfect workout. A bad beginning beats 45 minutes of paralysis every single time. Because once the engine starts to purr, the rules change. And here's that important part again. You do not need momentum to start. You need movement to create momentum. That's the shift. And it's why the smallest actions are often the most powerful ones. The dangerous thing about activation failure isn't just procrastination, it's misinterpretation. Because after enough missed deadlines, after enough half-finished projects, enough days where you watch yourself not move, people stop seeing a neurological pattern. They start seeing a moral failure. Lazy, undisciplined, irresponsible, broken. And when somebody lives with that interpretation for long enough, they don't just lose productivity. They lose trust in themselves. That's the real damage. But if this video did anything for you, I hope it helped separate those two things. Because struggling to activate is not the same thing as not caring. And understanding that difference changes how you fight this. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? You start asking, what does my brain need in order to move? That question is a lot more useful and also a lot more compassionate, because the goal isn't becoming somebody who never struggles. The goal is learning how to work with your brain instead of spending your life at war with it. But starting is only the first battle, because a lot of ADHD brains can create movement temporarily and still struggle to sustain it. The motivation fades, the novelty disappears, the distractions get louder, and suddenly the thing that felt possible yesterday feels impossible again. That's not a start problem, that's a stay problem. And that's what we're talking about next in the GSD system. So lock in on this playlist down below, and until next time, be safe and be well.